Okay, so you want to own a flower business. You picture a small storefront on a nice street, buckets of tulips and roses spilling out onto the sidewalk. You picture a wedding contract that pays five figures for a single Saturday, and a Valentine's Day rush so busy you need a waiting list. You picture margins that sound almost unfair, buying a stem for a few dollars and selling a finished arrangement for 50. It looks like a low-tech, high-charm business anyone with taste and a good eye can walk into and win. Sounds simple. It is not simple. Here is what nobody tells you. You are not actually in the flower business. You are in the perishable inventory business, selling a product that starts dying the moment it's cut, inside a $107 billion global market where the biggest player in America once collapsed under exactly the pressure you're about to sign up for. The flowers are romantic. The balance sheet is brutal. So how does a $10,000 flower cart actually compete in a $12 billion industry? Why do wholesale suppliers refuse to extend new florists any credit at all? And why did one of the most recognizable names in flower delivery, a company with over a century of history, end up filing for bankruptcy over a single bad Valentine's Day? Let's take this business apart the way it actually runs, not the way it looks through the shop window. Let's start with the number that decides everything else, and it's smaller than you'd think, which is exactly the trap. A lean, hey, home-based flower business can technically launch for under $5,000, a used cooler and an Instagram account, and that low number is what pulls people in. But a real brick-and-mortar shop, the kind with a storefront and walk-in customers, typically requires $23,000 on the low end and can climb past $150,000 for a larger, well-located store. And most of that money does not go toward flowers. It goes toward a piece of equipment most new owners never even think about until it's too late. That piece of equipment is the walk-in cooler, and it is quietly the single most important asset in the entire business. A proper commercial cooler holding steady between 34 and 38 degrees runs $3,000 to $15,000 installed, and what it buys you is time, stretching a flower's shelf life from 3 days to 7 or 10. Skip it, run a converted home refrigerator instead, and you're not just cutting a corner. You're accepting 40 to 60% higher waste rates, because every arrangement that dies before it sells is a total loss with zero salvage value. On top of the cooler, basic equipment and fixtures, work tables, vases, ribbon, a proper point-of-sale system built for florists, typically run another $6,000 to $8,000. Then there's the invisible engineering guts nobody photographs for the grand opening. Commercial refrigeration wiring, drainage for the constant water use, proper ventilation, and the retail licensing and business permits required just to legally operate a storefront that handles cash, deliveries, and perishable goods. And here's the part that catches almost every first-time owner completely off guard. Wholesale flower suppliers do not extend new florists credit terms. They start you on cash on delivery, meaning every single shipment has to be paid for in full, up front, before you've sold a single stem from it. That's not a policy quirk. It's a direct reflection of how often new flower businesses fail to pay their bills. And it means your working capital gets stress tested from week one, long before your first Valentine's Day proves whether the business actually works. Location matters more here than in almost any other retail category, and it's a cost most business plans underweight badly. Foot traffic isn't a nice-to-have for a florist. It's the difference between an urban shop pulling $10,000 to $30,000 a month and a small-town location stuck at $2,000 to $5,000. And that gap gets baked into your lease the day you sign it. A prime corner location with walk-in visibility can cost double the rent of a side street spot, but the side street spot may never generate enough spontaneous traffic to matter, which means you're not really choosing between two rents. You're choosing between two entirely different businesses wearing the same sign. And then there's sourcing itself, the part that sounds simple until you actually do it. Building a relationship with a reliable wholesale supplier, one who won't leave you scrambling 2 days before a holiday, takes months of consistent, on-time payment to earn trust. And until you have it, you're paying retail-adjacent wholesale prices with none of the leverage a 5-year customer enjoys. That relationship, invisible on any spreadsheet, is arguably worth more than the cooler itself once your business is a year or two old. Now you're open, and the fixed costs start ticking whether a single customer walks through the door or not. Rent is the obvious one, running every single month regardless of foot traffic, but the number that actually defines this business is wholesale flower purchasing, and it typically consumes 30 to 50% of total revenue, with real swings depending on the season. During normal months, florists put around 30 to 40% of revenue back into fresh inventory from wholesalers and growers. But during Valentine's Day and Mother's Day, that number spikes to 40 or even 50% of revenue, because wholesale prices themselves surge 10 to 20% when every florist in the country is buying roses at once. This is operating leverage working against you. Demand goes up, but so does your cost of goods at the exact moment you need margin the most. Labor is the second major fixed cost, typically running 20 to 35% of revenue, covering the floral designers who actually build the arrangements, the delivery drivers, and the retail staff handling walk-ins. During peak holidays, that number can spike to 35 or 40% of revenue, because you're hiring temporary designers and extra drivers just to survive a 72-hour window. And here's the uncomfortable math. You have to staff up and buy inventory for that surge as weeks in advance, committing real cash to a specific date with no way to know for certain how the week will actually land. Then there's the cost that never appears on anyone's dreamy Instagram tour of the shop, which is spoilage. Flowers are a 5-day shelf life product that you purchase 3 to 5 days before you actually know whether anyone will buy it. Every unsold bouquet from Tuesday is not a markdown opportunity like it would be in a normal retail store. It's simply gone, a direct loss with no salvage value whatsoever. Shops that survive long-term push their waste rate below 20%, and they only get there through pre-sold event work and aggressive markdown sales within the first 3 or 4 days. And underneath all of that sits the seasonal cash flow problem, which is arguably the real daily survival test in this business. January through March is consistently described by florists as a desert, the slowest trading months of the entire year, sitting right after your single busiest day. You need enough cash reserve, sitting idle, to cover full fixed costs through a genuinely dead quarter, and building that reserve is the difference between a shop that survives its first winter and one that doesn't. There's also a quieter fixed cost that behaves nothing like a normal retail expense, and that's refrigeration itself as an ongoing utility. Running a commercial cooler continuously, every hour of every day, regardless of how many customers come through the door, adds a meaningful and completely non-negotiable line to the monthly power bill. Unlike a restaurant that can turn off an oven overnight, a florist cannot let that cooler drift out of its narrow temperature band even once without risking the entire inventory sitting inside it. That single mechanical failure, a compressor going out on a Friday night before a big weekend, can destroy thousands of dollars of stock in a matter of hours, which is exactly why serious shops budget for a maintenance contract on that equipment the same way they budget for insurance. Here's the part of this business that separates the shops making real money from the ones just scraping by. And it's the exact same mechanic that makes movie theater popcorn wildly profitable while the ticket itself barely covers the lights. The everyday walk-in bouquet, the $10 or $15 arrangement grabbed on the way to dinner, is close to a loss leader. It keeps the lights on and the storefront relevant, but with wholesale costs eating 30 to 50% of the ticket and labor eating another chunk on top of that, the margin left over is thin. That is not where flower shop owners actually get wealthy. It never was. The real money sits in 3 places, and none of them are the flowers themselves. The first is weddings and events, where a shop can book $1,200 in average revenue per wedding at 40% margins, and a modest 8 weddings a month generates real gross profit against fixed costs that barely move. The second is corporate accounts and subscriptions, recurring, predictable revenue that doesn't depend on someone remembering to walk in the door. And shops generating serious owner income typically pull 40 to 60% of total revenue from exactly this category: weddings, corporate work, and subscriptions combined. The third is the add-on, the vase, the box of chocolates, the greeting card, items with high margins and essentially zero spoilage risk sold alongside every single transaction. This is why a flower shop is not really a retail operation at all. It is an events and relationship business that happens to have a storefront attached to it. And this is exactly the shift that makes the Valentine's Day math work in your favor instead of against you. That single holiday can generate 15 to 25% of annual revenue, but only if it's planned and pre-sold months ahead, locking in orders before the wholesale price spike even hits. The owner who treats every day like a walk-in day, hoping foot traffic saves them, is playing the low-margin game. The owner who treats the shop as an events business with a retail front door is playing the actual profitable one. Think about what this actually means for how an owner spends their week. Chasing walk-in traffic means competing on price against grocery store flower sections and gas station bouquets, a race to the bottom on a commodity nobody remembers buying a week later. Chasing wedding and corporate contracts means competing on relationships and trust, locking in revenue months before the flowers are even ordered, with a customer who isn't comparison shopping against a supermarket display. One of those strategies has you constantly restocking a cooler and hoping. The other has you booking a calendar and knowing. The shops that survive past year 3 have almost always figured out which game they're actually playing, and it isn't the one on the sidewalk sign. Every business has a variable it cannot control, and in floristry, it hides inside the calendar itself. The trapdoor under the floor is revenue concentration. Valentine's Day and Mother's Day alone can account for as much as 52% of a flower shop's entire annual revenue, packed into a handful of days scattered across the calendar. That means your entire year's financial health rides on the performance of maybe 3 specific weeks, and every single one of those weeks is also the week when your biggest cost, wholesale flowers, spikes hardest against you. Now stack the seasonality on top of the perishability, because this is where it becomes genuinely dangerous. You cannot understock a holiday, or you leave money on the table you'll never get back. But you cannot overstock it either, because unlike almost every other retail category, there's no clearance rack for a bouquet that didn't sell. It has zero salvage value within days, so every florist is forced to make a single, high-stakes purchasing bet weeks in advance, based on a demand forecast for a holiday that only happens once a year, using suppliers who are simultaneously spiking their own prices because everyone else is placing the exact same bet at the exact same time. Miss that forecast in either direction during your 2 or 3 biggest weeks of the year, and you don't get a quiet, average year to recover in. You get a genuinely bad one because there is no fourth quarter to make it up in. There's only next February, 12 months away. There's a second layer to this trap that rarely gets discussed, and it's the fact that you don't control the calendar itself. Valentine's Day. Falling on a weekend versus a weekday can swing revenue by tens of percentage points, because a weekday holiday competes directly with work schedules and school pickups, while a weekend holiday turns into an all-day event. You cannot move the date, you cannot control the weather that either helps or kills delivery logistics that day, and you cannot control whether a competing chain undercuts your pricing during the exact week your own margins are already being squeezed by wholesale spikes. Every other week of the year, a bad Tuesday is a rounding error. During your 2 or 3 critical weeks, a bad Tuesday is the whole year's plan. If you want to see what happens when a flower business bets everything on scale and debt instead of the fundamentals underneath it, look at what happened to FTD. Founded in Detroit in 1910 as Florists Telegraph Delivery, FTD spent most of the 20th century as the dominant name in flower-by-wire service, the network that let a florist in one city fulfill an order placed in another. It was a genuinely trusted institution inside the floral industry for generations. Then in 2014, seeing a disruptive new online rival named ProFlowers eating into its market share, FTD paid $430 million to acquire it outright, taking on roughly $120 million in acquisition debt to make the deal happen. The plan was to merge the two companies into one bigger, more efficient operation. It never actually worked. FTD was unable to fully integrate ProFlowers' technology and marketing teams with its own, and instead of strength, the merger produced years of internal friction. Sales in the core florist business fell 1% in 2016, then 9% in 2017, then another 9% in 2018, and the company's net loss for 2018 alone totaled $224.7 million. The debt from the acquisition didn't shrink to match the smaller company. It stayed exactly where it was, now sitting on top of a shrinking revenue base, breaching the loan covenants that limited debt relative to cash flow. And then came the final blow, delivered by the same holiday that's supposed to be every florist's best week of the year. In early 2019, lenders gave FTD a hard deadline of June 1st to find a way to repay its debt, and the company's disappointing Valentine's Day results that February sealed it. There was no rescue left. On June 3, 2019, FTD filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, breaking a 109-year-old company into pieces and selling ProFlowers, its own crown jewel acquisition, for just $95 million, a fraction of what it had paid for it 5 years earlier. The lesson here has nothing to do with flowers being a bad business. It has everything to do with what happens when you finance a perishable, seasonally concentrated business with acquisition debt sized for a completely different growth story. FTD didn't die because people stopped buying flowers. It died because its interest payments didn't care whether Valentine's Day landed well or badly, and one bad one, on top of years of shrinking revenue, was enough to end a century of history. What makes the FTD case genuinely instructive for a single shop owner, not just a corporate boardroom, is the mechanism underneath it. FTD didn't fail because flowers got less popular. It failed because a business with hard, fixed debt payments got layered on top of a revenue stream that was always going to be lumpy and seasonal by nature. A small independent florist doesn't carry $120 million in acquisition debt, obviously, but the same structural mismatch shows up at a tiny scale every single time an owner takes out a loan sized for steady, month-over-month revenue growth in a business that actually earns half its money in 2 or 3 weeks. The debt doesn't know it's February. It only knows the payment is due. Let's run the numbers on a realistic single-location flower shop, the kind with a proper cooler, 2 or 3 designers, and a genuine mix of walk-in and wedding business. In the optimistic scenario, the shop pulls in a healthy urban location's typical $15,000 to $20,000 a month in average revenue, and Valentine's Day and Mother's Day land well, contributing roughly half the year's total on their own. Wholesale costs stay controlled at the low end of the range, around 30 to 35% of revenue in normal months, and labor holds around 25%. Wedding and corporate work, booked and paid for in advance, contributes a meaningful share of stable, high-margin revenue on top of the walk-in traffic. Net margins land in the healthy 30 to 35% range that well-run shops report, and against a $50,000 startup investment, that shop can realistically pay itself back within 18 months to 2 years. Now, the realistic bad year. Valentine's Day falls on a weekday with worse weather than usual, and foot traffic and online orders both come in soft, the exact scenario that hurt FTD in its final year. Wholesale prices spike the usual 15 to 20% for the holiday regardless, because that cost is driven by nationwide demand, not by your individual store's performance. You've already committed to the inventory and the temporary staff, so those costs land in full even though revenue didn't. A slower than expected wedding season on top of that, only 5 bookings a month instead of 8, quietly erodes the high-margin category that was supposed to carry the shop through the slow months. Layer in the ordinary spoilage that comes from misjudging demand on a shortened, unpredictable holiday, and that same 30 to 35% net margin can compress to single digits, or disappear into a loss entirely, for the quarter that was supposed to fund the rest of the year. The difference between those two outcomes is not the quality of the flowers, and it's not the owner's talent with a bouquet. It's whether the 2 or 3 weeks the entire year depends on happen to land the way the spreadsheet assumed they would. Put those two scenarios side by side and the gap becomes uncomfortably clear. The optimistic version pays back a $50,000 investment in roughly 18 months to 2 years and leaves the owner with a genuinely healthy small business. The realistic bad year doesn't just erase a quarter's profit, it can push that payback timeline out past 3 or 4 years, because a thin margin business has almost no cushion to absorb one badly timed holiday. And unlike a business with steady, predictable monthly revenue, a florist can't simply work harder in March to make up for a soft February. The calendar has already moved on to the next slow stretch before the damage from the last one is even fully counted. So what are you actually buying when you buy a flower business? You are not buying a shop full of roses and tulips. You are buying a machine that turns perishable inventory into relationship revenue, one where the everyday bouquet barely covers its own cost, and the real profit gets built quietly through weddings, corporate accounts, and subscriptions that don't rot in a bucket if a Tuesday is slow. It's a business where your single biggest financial risk isn't a competitor down the street. It's the calendar itself, because a handful of days decide the entire year, and there is no clearance rack, no salvage value, and no next quarter to fix a bad one before next February comes back around. The flowers will always be beautiful. The question that actually decides whether you survive in this business is whether you built your numbers around the 2 weeks everything depends on, or whether you found that out the hard way, the way a 109-year-old company did, on a quiet Monday in June. Every romantic industry hides a spreadsheet underneath it, and floristry hides one of the least forgiving spreadsheets of any small retail business in existence. The margin looks generous on a single bouquet, but stack the wholesale spike, the labor surge, the spoilage, and the calendar concentration together, and generous becomes fragile fast. That fragility isn't a reason to walk away from the business. It's the actual skill the job requires, because the owners who last aren't the ones with the best eye for a centerpiece. They're the ones who treated a bucket of roses like the inventory risk it actually is, and built a business sturdy enough to survive the week it depends on most.